Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Greg Johnson. I'm the director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And it's our pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable event on religion and the 2024 election. So thank you again for joining us and giving up part of your evening for this event. In the interest of time, I'm going to forego the usual opening comments other than to thank our sponsors and the center's associate director, Dr. Dusty Hosley, who's operating behind the scenes to make sure everything goes smoothly and according to plan. So you know this webinar is being recorded, but the audience members won't appear on it. The 2024 election will decide the future of American democracy and reflects competing visions of American values and governance. Debates over abortion, immigration, the economy, the environment, guns, foreign relations, and more are shaped by changes in American society, including increased secularization, growing religious diversity, and the resurgence of Christian nationalism. What will these changes mean for the 2024 election and for America's political future? Tonight's roundtable panel will help us answer this question. We're honored that Professors Anthea Butler, Julie Ingersoll, and Joseph Blankholm, all experts on American religion and politics, can join us for this event. Anthea Butler is Geraldine R. Segal Professor in American Social Thought and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research spans African American religion and history, evangelicalism, nationalism, race, politics, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. Her most recent book is White Evangelical Racism: The Politics of Morality in America. She is a frequent commentator on MSNBC and other media outlets. Julie Ingersoll is professor of religious studies at University of North Florida. She specializes in American religion with a focus on gender, violence, evangelicalism, and Christian Reconstruction. Her most recent book is Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. Joseph Blankholm is Associate Professor of Religious Studies here at UCSB. His research focuses on varieties of the non-religious, including secularism, atheism, and spirituality. His most recent book is The Secular Paradox on the Religiosity of the Not Religious. Our format tonight is the following. Each presenter will have about 15 minutes to speak with us about issues they find most compelling in this context. Once we have heard from all three, then we'll take another pass, hearing from them again as they respond to issues raised by the others or other topics that they wish to unpack for us. If time remains at the end of our hour and 15 minutes, then I'll invite all three of our guests onto the screen to engage one another directly. And then at 6:15 Pacific time, we'll call it a night, and thank you all for your time. And I want to thank our presenters for giving overtime at this very busy season to address a topic that's so pertinent to all of us. It goes without saying. So with gratitude, thank you. And I'd like to invite Professor Butler onto the screen to please share your thoughts with us.
Thanks, Greg. And thank you all for joining us. I hope desperately that you all have a nice glass of California wine or your favorite beverage with you, because you're going to need it by the time I'm finished talking tonight. So I want to start off with a clip. And this clip is from a worship leader, Sean Foyt. This is from about a year ago. Sean Foyt happened to be in my neck of the woods 2 weeks ago in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, as you know, is a very big part of this election cycle. And he was there doing what they called the Kingdom to the Capitol. And he will be having this coming weekend a very big rally out on the mall, drawing Christian voters onto his side to vote for Donald Trump. So I want to show you this clip, and then I'm going to talk to you about what I see is the biggest issue for us in 2024 and beyond. And I'll just let that play for you, and you can decide what you want to think about it afterwards.
The king coming back. That's what we're practicing for. That's why hell hates it that we're worshiping at every capital across America. That's why we get called, well, you're a Christian nationalist. You want the kingdom to be the government. Yes. You want God to come and overtake the government. Yes. You want Christians to be the only ones that, yes, we do. We wouldn't be a disciple of Jesus if we didn't believe that. We want God to be in control of everything. We want believers to be the ones writing the laws. Yes, guilty as charged. I mean, it's funny when I meet Christians where I'm like, I'm like, have you read the Great Commission? Like, this is actually what we want. Guilty.
That was Sean Foyke speaking to a group of people who had gathered together for a meeting. And essentially, this is about Christian nationalism, but it's about a lot more than Christian nationalism. You've probably heard this term bandied about throughout the last couple of years up until this election cycle. But for those of us like me who have been studying this for a long time, Christian nationalism is just a part of it. What it really is about establishing a theocratic government. And you'll hear more from Julie tonight, Ingersoll, who will tell you a lot more about that. But I want to set the framework for you and set the stage about why this is so important and what did we miss. One of the things I think that was really missed during this election cycle and prior election cycles is how much evangelicals, Pentecostals, and other groups were organizing. And I believe that we didn't pay attention to that because we've had a sort of a shorthand about how we've talked about this. Our shorthand for religious people in politics is evangelicals. And that shorthand of evangelicalism means white, okay? And that's how the media uses it. And that's how you've heard about it if you've been following elections from, let's say, the 80s with Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush to Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama to Trump and to Biden. We've all heard about the role of evangelicals within election cycles. What we haven't really done is to think about how certain things have come together to see how people really wanted a project. And that project was not just about destroying Roe versus Wade. That project was not about trying to stop same sex marriage, but the project was about something bigger. And that project was about establishing a Christian nation, a theocracy. Now, if you don't know what that word theocracy means, Sean Foyke just told you what it was. It's about having Christians in every area of power. It's about having a nation that is established on Christian principles. And one of the people who explicated this so well a couple of years ago was General Mike Flynn, when he said that it should be one nation under God, a Christian nation, that other religions didn't matter. Now, this is not how the founders and the framers came here, but this is what the project is all about. And so, in this 2024 election cycle, what we have seen is a whole different kind of mobilizing by religious people, and explicitly religious people who are sold up for Christian nationalism, who are involved in traditionalist kinds of movements, who also are happy about Roe versus Wade being rescinded and want Donald Trump back in office because they believe that he will be the best person to put forward the ideas that they have about the nation. Now, you might be wondering this question that I got a lot back during the 2016 election cycle, which was, why would Christians want to be with Donald Trump? We know them as people who didn't want adulterers. In the past, evangelicals have been very serious about people who have run for office and how they've hounded people who have not been morally right. But one of the things I say in my book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, is that morality is a shield. Morality is a shield to hide from the public that religious actors like this want power. They want power and authority in this country. And that power and authority you can see in this election cycle because you can see what the Project 2025 has been all about. Project 2025 is a very important part of this cycle of how they want to make a theocratic state. If we can think about the things that it asked for, such as the destruction of the Department of Education, this ties back into all the different kinds of things that evangelicals and Pentecostals and others have been about since the 1970s. We want vouchers. We don't want public schools. We think public schools are bad. We want to ban books. All of these things are of a piece. And so if you are just somebody who's diving into this, trying to figure out why do we have all these religious people involved with Trump? Why are they involved with such a person? It's not because they necessarily think that he has to explicitly be religious. They believe that he is the best person to bring about what they want. And so, if you've been paying attention to the news, you can see that Project 2025 has been talked about, but there's also another project, Project 47, that Donald Trump has that goes into even greater detail about the things that he wants to do. And so, if people need links for this, you can just ask afterwards, and I can give the CAP Center to give this to you. But what I want to say right now is important because I think we need to think about what is happening and what is coming. 2 weeks before the election cycle, we know that there's a flurry of activity. And one of the things that we have not taken into account, or I would say that some of us have, but a lot of us have tried to ignore, is the specter of violence. And let's go back to January 6, 2021. When January 6, 2021 happened, for many people, that was a surprise. For those of us who had been watching what was happening during the election cycle of 2020, it was not a surprise, in part because religious leaders and Trump signaled to us what would happen. A month before then was a Jericho march around Washington, D.C. to claim the land. Now, Jericho march is when you march around in Old Testament scripture and try to claim this land for the nation of Israel. Now, in modern day parlance for Pentecostals, that means you are claiming land that you think belongs to Christians and it belongs to someone. And that happened a month beforehand, before January 6th happened. On the morning of January 6th, what happened? The first thing that happened was prayer. You had Paula White, who was a spiritual advisor for Donald Trump during the 2016 election cycle and beyond, prayed for him right before he got up and started telling people to march to the Capitol. And now we are finding out more and more about this. And there were many religious people who were involved in January 6th. Now, if we extrapolate this forward, the kinds of violence and the kinds of things that we are seeing are very different. Let me give you a couple of examples of why I am worried. Number one, I was worried because a couple of years ago, Donald Trump had a meeting not in a normal place, but in Waco, Texas. Waco, Texas was the site of the Branch Davidians. And the Branch Davidians were very much against what happened governmentally. It was a terrible situation. It probably should never have fallen out the way that it did, where the compound was burnt down. But this was a moment for people to come together with Trump at a very volatile place that actually has a lot of resonance for people involved in conspiracy theories, QAnon, and for outliers who are anti-government people. And so that was a signal back then to everyone that we need to be prepared for what is coming. That's the first thing. Secondarily, some of you may have watched Rachel Maddow this past week. She profiled a group that is right here in Pennsylvania, about maybe 125 or a little bit more miles than that from me, called Rod of Iron. This group is run by the son of Sun Myung Moon, who has separated from his mother and the Church of the Unification Church, and believes that the AR-47 and other guns are the rod of iron spoken about in Scripture, and that they are following the will of God by carrying guns. This past weekend, when they were there, General Flynn was there, people from Trump's prior administration were there. This was a very troublesome meeting. And so, what I expect and what I worry about is the specter of violence in this election cycle. We already know that there are challenges being put up to the election. We already know that there are carve outs by groups like Turning Point USA and others who have been rallying evangelicals and other like minded Christian conservatives to work the polls, to be poll watchers and others during this election cycle. And so, one of the things that we'll need to be prepared for and ready for is the ways in which people who have bought into this kind of thinking and idealism, and also the conspiracies that Trump has been promoting, whether they be conspiracies about trans people, conspiracies about Haitians, conspiracies about all these things, These things feed into their fears. And so when people are fearful, they tend to want to think about how they can protect themselves. And so one of the things that I think that we need to be looking at on the horizon is not just November 5th, but after November 5th. I can promise you several things, and then I'm going to close to make sure, and then we can have a discussion about this. One of the things I think is going to happen is that we will not know definitively on November 5th, not because it won't be a clear-cut election, but because they plan to put up challenges. That's number one. Number two, I hope against hope that there will not be violence, but I believe that there will be outbursts of violence. And this is not going to be on a January 6th level. This is going to pop out across the nation and in certain kinds of places because you can already see the chatter ramping up about it. And this is not to fearmonger. This is just to tell you that for those of us who've been watching this for a very long time, the language and the rhetoric that Donald Trump has been putting out is actually activating people. It is making people think that this is a last stand sort of thing. When a few months ago, when he said, you don't have to go vote, and now he's like desperately trying to get people out to vote, that is a signal that something else is going on and that we know by the organizing and other things that are happening, by Capitol marches, things that happened, Esther March that happened 2 weeks ago at the Capitol, Sean Foyt's current march to the Capitol that'll be happening in a week or so. All of these things are coming together to make for a volatile situation. So the loss won't be just a loss, it will be a call to action. And that call to action could be something very dangerous. That's number one. Number two is all of the things that we're finding out now about Donald Trump, whether that's the Atlantic article today about him saying that he wanted, um, excuse me, generals like Hitler, which is very terrible, or the facts about Vanessa Gillian, whose funeral he would not pay for, and he said some very racial, awful things. These are also important. Third, Trump's play to race right now should be seen as a ploy. You're hearing a lot about African American men going over to Trump. You saw him today with other Latino groups, I believe in Florida and others. This play for race should not make you think that Trump is not a racist person. He is. He is telling you every day who he is and why he's into white supremacy. And I believe this focus in on white supremacy and patriarchy this election cycle, where you've heard religious people say women shouldn't be voting, his thing about Kamala Harris is stupid. All of these things are ramping up to a crescendo. And that crescendo can bring nothing but violence and animosity and distrust about the election results. Finally, this do not expect this to go away, even if Kamala Harris wins. It will not go away. It will not be silent. It will only morph into something else. For years and years and years, people often thought this is going to be over. The religious right is dead. They're not dead. They're a very energized zombie because this has always been here. And whether or not you believe it, it doesn't matter. It is here. It is well funded. It is intense. It is intricate. And I've just touched the surface of everything that is happening. And I hope that tonight you'll take away from each one of us and try to get a better picture about how religion and politics are sadly working in America today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Butler. When you come back on in a minute, we'd love to hear a bit about the vibe on the ground in Pennsylvania, because here in California, we're a bit buffered, and I'm afraid sometimes to our detriment. And to hear what it's feeling like there would be great, but powerful words. Thank you. Professor Ingersoll.
Hi. Thanks to everybody for being here. I also want to offer some gratitude to the CAP Center, to Greg Johnson for the invitation, and for Dusty Hosley for all of his work to make this happen. He's a great organizer. So I am going to quickly share my screen, I hope. Can't make that go away. There we go. Sorry. There we go. It's hiding there. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about MAGA, Christian nationalism, and playing the long game. And I want to start by saying that everything that Anthea just said, I agree with, and right down to the language of Christian nationalism. And maybe when we have our conversations together later, that will be something that we could talk about. I struggled with the language, the shift to the language of Christian nationalism. To begin with, I've kind of adopted it just because it's what everybody uses. And so if I want to talk about the thing that we're talking about, it's easier to use the language. But I agree that what it really means is an effort to establish a theocratic state. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky, and I always like to hear from folks who've been at these webinars. I want to start by talking about religion and social movements and MAGA and how those all fit together. Because what we have is a coalescence of groups and interests around Trump and authoritarianism. These are just some of the influences. There's the manosphere, the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis. And apparently now we have Russian paid agitators, and of course, the Christian nationalists. In order to understand how this all fits together, we need to recognize that religion is more than a set of beliefs. People often come to the study of religion thinking that religions are these discrete little systems. They're separate from each other. There's a kind of little creedal formula, and you can read each one and decide which one you agree with and pick that one. But religion really doesn't work that way. The boundaries are really permeable. It's better thought of as a fluid assemblage of ideas, traditions, and practices, all of which happen in the context of communities. So the edges of religious systems and the edges of these groups that we don't classify as religious, but are as social movements, the edges are permeable, and people move between them and pick components that seem to work for them at any given time. So Greg asked us to think about issues that we found either compelling or fraught in the last couple of weeks leading up to the election. And so I decided to talk about first the time horizon with which Christian nationalism works, and then secondly, the potential for violence and some of the rhetoric and frameworks that lend themselves to possible violence. So the forms of Christianity that I'm going to talk about contribute to the character of the MAGA movement. These are also fluid, sometimes even contradictory with each other, but they are playing a long game, and they each contribute to the potential for violence. So first of all, I'm going to talk about evangelicals. You can think about Baptists, Presbyterians, but we shouldn't get hung up on denominations, because this stuff does not divide by denominations like we used to think. I'm not sure it ever did, but we used to think that it did. So there's evangelicals, there's Catholics, and there's charismatics and Pentecostals. It should go without saying, although just for the sake of saying it, I'll say it. I don't mean all evangelicals. I don't mean all Baptists or all Presbyterians or all Catholics or all charismatics or all Christians or any of that. These are threads in those traditions. And I'm particularly interested in focusing in on the aspects of these traditions that lend themselves to an effort to transform society, to make everything conform to how they understand religious demands, and the time horizon that they hope to do, within which they hope to do that, because I think that's really important, and also the ways that they contribute to the potential for violence. So the first of these are white conservative evangelicals. This is the group we normally think of when we think of Christian nationalism. I have here a cover of a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, that came out last year. Stephen Wolfe wrote this. I write about a version of Christian nationalism, a version that is related to Stephen Wolfe's, that dates to the mid-20th century, called the Christian Reconstructionists. But Stephen Wolfe picks up much of the work of the Christian Reconstructionists and sort of remakes it for today. This book is published by someone else who does that, whose name is Doug Wilson. These are important contemporary figures in this white conservative evangelical movement. So the Christian Reconstructionists laid out something that they called dominionism. They took this from the book of Genesis, where God told Adam and Eve to exercise dominion over the world. And the way that the Reconstructionists understand the exercise of dominion is by working out the application of biblical law to all of society and culture. So they are theocratic and they are authoritarian. they're also deeply patriarchal. And when I say that, I don't mean the sort of run-of-the-mill sexism that we encounter all the time. I'm referring to a deep-seated framework that undergirds everything that they understand about what the theocracy should look like. And this isn't a theocracy just for Christians, and it's not a theocracy that has only to do with government. This pertains to all aspects of life and culture, and is it is an obligatory obedience, whether you call yourself a Christian or not. And patriarchy undergirds all of that. The entirety of society is organized in patriarchal ways for them. It's a label that they embrace. This isn't me giving a critical characterization of them. They call themselves patriarchal. And these are the folks who 20 years ago, I would write about how behind the scenes they would talk about eliminating the women's right to vote. But these are the people who will say it in public now. They say it on Twitter. They'll say this in public now. So another important component that the Christian Reconstructionists and white conservative evangelicals contribute to Christian nationalism is a long time horizon. These guys are post-millennialist. That is, they think the kingdom of God was established at the resurrection, and they think that Christians are here to build it. That is what dominion is about, and it'll take however long it takes, thousands of years potentially. One of their homeschool leaders produced and sold a 200-year family plan for dominion to homeschooling families. And in terms of their contribution to the concerns about violence, for these folks, pluralism is heresy. And heresy, according to biblical law, is punishable by death. So there is a clear-cut argument that toleration and pluralism and the idea that you might have a secular civil society and everybody might have their own religious views is considered heresy for these folks. The second of the groups that I want to talk about are the Catholics, the integralist movement and its relationship to the administrative state. These folks are hierarchical and they want a strong central authority that is religious, not just a strong central authority that is religious over religion, but they want to integrate, that's where the name comes, they want to integrate church and state. They're cultural warriors, also patriarchal. And we have two really important examples of the contribution that they've made to Christian nationalism in the form of the Federalist Society. Leonard Leo is, Donald Trump occasionally likes to take credit for the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but it really probably redounds to Leonard Leo, who worked for decades to transform the courts, plural, including the Supreme Court, but the problem is a lot bigger than the Supreme Court. And then also the Heritage Foundation and their Project 2025. It's 900 pages. I bet most of you haven't read it. I did read it over the summer. I want to encourage you that the first 16 pages are an excellent sort of overview of what's there and the tone of it and the framing of it. So you can really read 16 pages and get a real sense of what Project 2025 is about without reading all of the bureaucratic minutia. But it contains a really important classification system that is filled with demonization. So there are the people on whom the Heritage Foundation, on whose behalf the Heritage Foundation is working, suggesting that those of us who don't like what the Heritage Foundation wants to do aren't people. But one of the clearest examples of this is Project 2025 wants to classify any teaching about gender and sexuality as pornography. And they want to make pornography illegal. And then they say, this is in there, this isn't me characterizing it again. They want to have teachers and librarians registered as sex offenders and arrested because teaching gender and sexuality is pornography in the way that they characterize it. So they're demonizing teachers and librarians. There's a whole framework of gender and family that comes from Catholic natural law in Project 2025. And a lot of it centers around the breakdown of families. But what they're really concerned about is any kind of policy or practice that gives room for women's autonomy contributes, in their view, to the breakdown of families, because women have choices in that case. And sometimes that might mean that families break. And so they're opposed to all of those. And it's not just about Roe versus Wade and abortion. It is also about in vitro fertilization, and it's also about contraceptives, and it may well be about the women's right to vote. When you worry about the breakdown of families and I have a quote, it says we should wield power to rescue kids from the breakdown of families, and every threat to family stability must be confronted. And then enter J.D. Vance, who says that women should stay in abusive relationships for the benefit of their families. And J.D. Vance comes out of this conservative Catholic tradition. The third example is the charismatic or Pentecostal movement. Anthea talked about this a bit, so I'm gonna go through it really quickly. It arose in the 1990s among Pentecostals and charismatics. It's connected to the first white evangelicals, the Christian Reconstructionists, because the Reconstructionists, being Calvinists, didn't have a lot of popular appeal. They called themselves the Frozen Chosen, and they knew they couldn't spread their theology. And so, but the charismatic movement was burgeoning across the globe, and they said, if we can get them to embrace dominion theology, then they'll take it with them, and that's what happened. The NAR built their own form of dominionism. They call it Seven Mountains Mandate, but it's more or less this, from the point of view of an outsider, it's the same. The insiders quibble over differences. But the NAR, I think their most important contribution to the things that have me concerned as we go into the last 2 weeks of this election and beyond is their focus on spiritual warfare and their understanding of it as not metaphorical. It's literal for them. When they talk about a battle, they are talking not about spiritual forces, but about literally embodied demons and angels, but demons who are their neighbors and their coworkers. If you look at the people in the image here trying to make their way into the Capitol, the people standing between these folks and the Capitol building are the demons. It's a little hard to get your brain around if you aren't familiar with the way that folks talk in this world. Because things like spiritual warfare sound metaphorical to most Christians. Christians use this language, but they don't usually mean it literally, and they don't usually attach the identity of demons to individual real people. I've got a little example of that that's really quite disturbing. As Anthea mentioned, when Trump first ran for president, people were like, how could evangelicals support him? And the invocation of the biblical type of a King Cyrus was one of the justifications. Cyrus was a Persian king who brought Israel out of the Babylonian exile. The narrative being that God used him even though he was a pagan king. That's one way of applying the Bible to Donald Trump as a candidate, but that one has been replaced by one that is much more disturbing, and that is Trump as Jehu. Who is Jehu? Well, give me a second and I'll tell you. So the next thread here is the identification of Vice President Harris with the biblical figure of Jezebel. Jezebel was a foreign queen, the wife of Ahab. She was from another land. She worshipped another god, and she was murdered by Jehu, who was a general. He threw her out of a window and then fed her body to dogs. So it's a vile, graphic depiction of violence. And it's been recast as being all about sexual sin, even though that doesn't seem to be part of the story. But her demise is widely referenced and celebrated in conservative Christianity. And VP Harris is often identified with Jezebel. And for these folks, it's not an unhappy coincidence that the sexualized version of this story plays well into racist tropes about Black women and sexuality. But the thing to take away from this in terms of violence is that when they use this language, they are not being metaphorical. And I don't know how that happened. Sorry. So I want to draw on Mark Juergensmeyer just a little bit to talk about demonization and cosmic war. Each of these movements invokes a framework that lends itself to demonizing opponents and thinking about conflict in terms of cosmic values. Juergensmeyer says that demonization precedes violence, and that if we have an earthly conflict, a mundane conflict, that it can be negotiated, but when we instantiate it with cosmic good and evil, it becomes unresolvable. And that's what happened. That's what's happening here. So pluralism is heresy. The entire framing of Project 2025. Kevin Roberts said this summer that the document outlines a bloodless revolution if the left will allow it, leaving open the possibility that some of us may not want that to happen. The spiritual war made literal and the enemy within that we're hearing a lot about these days. Also important. So there's this threat of violence that has me concerned, both short term and long term. But I think that I'm not one for optimism necessarily, but I think the little bit of optimism here is that these folks have been playing a long game, and it's starting to pay off with Roe versus Wade, attacks on public education. And we can't confront the threat to democracy and its long-term strategies with a short-term time horizon. And up till this point, we've focused on an election or a current crisis, and we haven't thought in long term. And the reason I find that a little bit hopeful is because that's something that we can change. I don't know what to do about the potential violence, but I know that we can change our engagement in these issues so that as soon as the election is over, we don't wash our hands and walk away. So thank you for your time. It's so nice to be with all of you.
Professor Ingersoll, thank you so much. Chilling. It's really a gripping story, but thank you for sharing. And as I asked of Professor Butler, maybe when we all come back on the screen, you could tell us a little bit about your sense of things on the ground in Florida. Another contrast with California. But thank you very much. Yeah. Professor Blankholm, if I could ask you to come on the screen.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining this event, for listening and being part of this. And thanks to Dusty and to Greg for organizing this, inviting me to participate. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel with Anthea and Julie. And so far it's been fun. And I also want to say hello to my students in my religion and politics course here at UCSB. I'll see you in our lecture on Thursday. I'm going to be talking about two things. The first is the importance of this election for the courts and the importance of religion in US law in general. And I think this phrase might sound weird at first, but religious basically means exception to state authority as far as the law is concerned. And I think that's kind of an intense thing to say. It's not how we usually think about religion and religious, but I'll be explaining what I mean by that and giving some examples. And then the second thing I want to talk about is just the decline of religion. I think on the surface, we might think that this is good news for the Democratic Party, but I want to explain why this isn't necessarily the case. I don't think that the Democrats can take the non-religious for granted. And arguably, I mean, this is what the Democratic Party has done since the 90s with working class people and their embrace of free trade. And it's arguably a mistake that the party's made since the Obama era with Hispanic increasingly with Black voters, especially men. Demographic changes alone, I just don't think they're going to save the Democratic Party. And that's just as true for non-religion as it is for race. So religion, interestingly, has not been a big part of this election cycle. Both candidates have been downplaying it, and that doesn't mean it's not important. I think that just means that they don't see an advantage in making it a talking point. For Trump, that's partly because he's already got the religious voters that he's likely to secure. Anthea talked a little bit about this. You know, he's courted anti-abortion Christians. He did that in 2016. He had to talk about his Christian bona fides a lot more in that election. And he delivered on his promise by appointing 3 Supreme Court justices who then in 2022, as we all know, overturned Roe v. Wade. But I think we have to remember a number of things. One, that's just one decision, and that's just a decision by the Supreme Court. And yes, our judicial system is top down, and we're going to have a conservative Supreme Court for a long time, but the lower courts matter too, and the state courts matter also. So not all cases make it to the Supreme Court, not all cases go through the federal courts, and the lower courts, the lower federal courts have to interpret what the Supreme Court means, even when it's intentionally vague. And that's how the court was, for instance, about prayer in public schools in its 2022 decision, Kennedy v. Bremerton. So conservative activists have understood all of this for a long time. if we just want to like be clear about it, conservative activists have understood that voting for president is how you vote for the judiciary, because you can't vote directly. Just to get a little context for this, over a 4-year term, a US president is probably going to appoint around a quarter to a third of federal judges to lifetime appointments. So if you think about it that way, it's really a huge impact on the judiciary overall. I think that conservative activists have also done a really good job expanding religious freedom through the courts. So if we stick with this idea that religious basically means exception to state authority, expanding religious freedom is expanding exceptions to state authority. That's usually a good thing for conservatives, though the left is also learning how to use that power. If somebody wants to read it, in 2019, there was a really interesting report that was put out by the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia University, and it focused on the potential for leftist activists to use religious freedom law. The strategy here is basically, if you can't beat them, join them. They know that it's really fraught to further erode that wall between separation of church and state that's been erected, partially piecemeal, but they're saying maybe we can jump through some of the holes that are now getting wider. They're trying to do a less aggressive version of what the Satanic Temple has actually been doing for years. They're not trolling like the Satanic Temple, but they're saying, hey, we can get religious freedom protections too, because we're spiritual, because we're liberal Christian, because we're Jewish, or because we're atheists, and atheists have been getting religious freedom protections for more than 60 years. So I want to give you a couple of examples. I'll start with Satanists because they're really provocative, but I think they really help us understand the situation. So the Satanic Temple, to be clear, these Satanists, they don't believe in Satan. They're trolling Christians who believe in Satan. It's pretty edgy stuff, and it's meant to be, but we should try to read beyond the surface, because basically the Satanic Temple is a separation of church and state advocacy group. A good example to understand this is their statue of Baphomet. I had to learn this. Baphomet is a goat-headed deity that's been either worshipped or said to be worshipped in Europe for centuries, and then later on in places influenced by European colonialism. Over the past decade or so, the Satanic Temple has been threatening to bring a statue of Baphomet that they literally built, and they've been threatening to bring it to places where Christians have been trying to put up 10 Commandment statues on, say, courthouse lawns. That particular set of law, if you put up a 10 Commandment statue that's donated, you also have to put up donated statues from other traditions, including from Satanists. And this has been held up in court. So basically they're saying, if you want to do that, you got to put up Baphomet. And usually what happens, I think quite understandably, no statues for anybody. Another example is their after-school Satan Club. Again, really provocative. They do this because in 2001, there's a case called Good News Club versus Milford Central School. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that evangelical Christians could organize after-school clubs in public schools, in classrooms, after school's out. Over the past decade, Satanists have said, well, we're a religion too, so we can have clubs too. And their clubs really focus on science because they're mostly like atheists, and they're coming from that perspective. And they're really setting up these clubs with the support of parents who don't want the Good News Club in their school. So if they're going to do it, we can do it too. And that's going to cause tensions on the local level. And I think another example that's less extreme than the Satanists is one of Dr. Scott Warren. He volunteered for years with an organization called No More Deaths that leaves food and water and other supplies for migrants who are crossing the Sonora Desert. And Warren was arrested in 2017 for leaving these supplies. He was kind of caught up in a sting that found that the organization was also caring for migrants in like small shacks, basically. And Warren was acquitted of the harshest charges that he faced in 2019 in federal court after making an argument that religious freedom laws actually protect his right to answer his conscience and care for migrants. He argued specifically that he has spiritual beliefs, though he could have also argued if he wanted that he's protected as an atheist. That's not what he did. It's really easier to get protections if you're more traditionally religious in some sense. So how do we get here to this point where we have Satanists and activists like Scott Warren who are taking advantage of religious freedom protections that I think most of us would more often associate with conservatives? Really, this changes in the early 90s. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is federal legislation that was passed in 1993, had bipartisan support, broad broad pressure from a variety of religious leaders. And since that time, we've also seen states pass legislation like it. Sometimes they're called state RFRAs or mini RFRAs. And the way that checks and balances work in the US system, the legislatures at the federal and state levels, they can influence how the courts interpret religious freedom questions. And they're basically saying, hey, we want the state to have to really prove that it has what's called a compelling interest anytime that they make a law that affects religious freedom in some way. They want to make sure that the burden isn't on religious people. Like there's kind of a scale in where the burden is. They want to make sure that the scales tip toward the state and they have to show more. So these laws, they put more burden on the state to show it has a compelling interest, and it gives them, it gives religious individuals and religious groups an interpretive advantage, because judges here, they're really these like interpretive figures. Laws are ambiguous. And I want to give you a couple more examples now from the conservative side after we've kind of cracked this open by looking at it more broadly. They've used the expansion of religious freedom to get advantage in all kinds of ways, including to get the right to discriminate, which is, I think, quite surprising at first. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church against a former teacher named Cheryl Parrish. She was working at a school that was affiliated with the church. She went on leave for having narcolepsy. She developed narcolepsy, and then they hired someone else to replace her while she was gone, didn't give her a job back. This is something that is usually prohibited by the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, but the court actually ruled that this is acceptable because the church and the school, by extension, that it's affiliated with, they should be able to control who they hire and fire. The idea is that they should be able to control, they should have full say over who their clergy are. It shouldn't be a question that's regulated by, say, the Civil Rights Act or something like that. This is one of many cases in which religion and religious organizations are special and they have more rights. They can carve out state authority. A much more recent case is Kennedy v. Bremerton, 2022 case in which the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a high school football coach in the state of Washington who was leading prayers on the field after football games. The school had received complaints, and because of all the controversy around it, didn't want to renew the coach's contract, but it became a huge flashpoint in the culture wars. And so the court ended up throwing out decades of precedent that said situations like this need to be decided by, say, like the Lemon test or other kind of somewhat clear tests that the superintendent of a school could turn to and say, like, okay, this is a situation where we can't have this, or this is a situation where we can. Now the court says it needs to be determined based on historical practices and understandings. This is probably an intentionally vague phrasing because it has a chilling effect on all cases. Even lower courts don't know what's acceptable and what's not, so they don't really want to push it. They don't want to push it up to the higher courts. People don't want to bring expensive lawsuits. My overall point here is that this election is going to have a huge impact on the judiciary, and we're going to see those ripple effects in all kinds of ways for decades. It's not just Trump wins or Harris wins and then Trump does X or Harris does X. It's a lot more complicated. If Trump wins, Americans are likely to have more religious freedom. But when we say that, we need to understand that religious, again, in this case, means exception to state authority. We also need to understand that even though Satanists and activists like Scott Warren are getting protections, they're really at the edge or the limits. This is something that's being pioneered, and they're not winning all their cases. This is really helping people who are Christian, who really look like traditional Christians in key ways. It's an easier argument to make if you're Christian. And these exceptions, I should be clear, they also include exceptions to taxes. That's a huge part of it. Very lucrative exceptions to taxes. And again, exceptions to discrimination laws. That's exactly what happened with Cheryl Parrish when she developed narcolepsy. So in the little bit of time I have left, I want to talk about non-religion. That's really squarely where my interests lie now, even though I've done some legal anthropology in the past. Maybe you've heard about this group, the religiously unaffiliated. They're often called the religious nuns, which is I guess a confusing pun. It's not N-U-N-S, it's N-O-N-E-S. This group, the religiously unaffiliated, they make up about 28% of the US population. In recent years, it seemed like maybe that they're kind of staying there, just below a third. Sometimes we hear that they have no religion in press, but this is really not true. Some of them do and some of them don't. I think the simple way to put it is that the religious nuns, They don't belong religiously. They don't identify with their religion. But many of them still believe religious things, or they do religious things like pray. In survey terms, the nuns are those people who say that they're atheist or agnostic or nothing in particular. They're combining all three of those. Those are the so-called religious nuns. If we combine atheists and agnostics, they're still less than 10% of the overall US population. That means that almost 20% of the country is nothing in particular. It's a lot. About a fifth of the country is nothing in particular when you ask them what religion they are. Atheists and agnostics, we actually know a lot about. They're easy to predict based on other variables. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to be civically engaged. Atheists in particular are more likely to vote for Kamala Harris in this election than white evangelicals are likely to vote for Trump. So very high rate. Atheists and agnostics are really left politically overall. And I don't have time to get way into it, but this is really because atheists and agnostics usually have belief systems. They're just not belief systems that have a place for a Christian God. I co-authored an essay on this recently with some colleagues called The Beliefs of Non-Believers. The nothing in particulars, they're a real mix. If nothing in particular sounds like a blah category, that's because it is. The nothings lean left, with almost 60% saying that they're going to vote for Harris in a poll that was fielded at end of August, early September, but they're not really a single kind of person. They're like a broken category, that surplus of that broken category. So the nothings, they're all over the place. Some of them are formerly religious people who still believe in God and still pray regularly. Some are basically atheists who just didn't answer with the term atheist. But a lot of those who say they're nothing in particular, when we ask about religion, they're kind of nothings in general. They're undecided about religion. They're undecided about all kinds of stuff. A lot of them are undecided about who to vote for. It's a way of being in the world. So this group, the nothings, they're some of the least engaged in the American electorate. When we look at the numbers, they're not as likely to vote as atheists or agnostics, but they're also not as likely to vote as almost all kinds of religious Americans. In the interviews that I've done with these folks, some of them just don't like thinking or talking about things like religion or politics. It's sort of a conscious decision sometimes, but it's also sometimes people say, I don't really think about that. I haven't thought about that really ever. I don't really even have phrases, sentences, concepts to think about it. They just don't want to go there, or they haven't gone there and they don't feel comfortable going there. So these nothings are why the decline of religion doesn't mean more support for Democrats. 2/3 of the religious nuns are nothings. Around 20% of the country right now are nothings. More atheists, more agnostics, that does mean more support for Democrats, but more nothings does not. And there are coming to be more and more nothings. They're up for grabs. And we've seen Trump in this presidential cycle consciously court them, especially young men who fall into this category. So just to sum up, I think this religion is a lot about religion in the courts, this election. And I think that really, this is true of elections for many decades now. And I think the Democrats would be foolish to continue to take the support of the non-religious for granted. As I mentioned before, they've already done this in some ways with Hispanic and Black men in particular, who we see turning toward Trump and toward the Republican Party. And demography is not going to decide this or future elections, even if we can predict how some people in these categories are likely to vote sometimes. Thank you.
Professor Blankholm, thank you. That was so admirably lucid, just spot on. Again, chilling, but thank you. I neglected to mention that we won't be taking questions from the audience today in the interest of time. What we're going to do instead is I'm inviting our other panelists back onto the screen, and we'll go in the same order again. They'll have a chance to respond to things their colleagues said or other ideas that have occurred to them. And then if there's time remaining, we'll engage in a little bit of crosstalk until 6:15. So, Dusty, if you could arrange us accordingly with the screen view, and Professor Butler, I invite you to respond to things you've heard or share further ideas.
Yeah.
And tell us about Pennsylvania. We lived.
That's what you want to hear about. You really want to hear about Pennsylvania.
Well, I lived for some time in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was at Franklin and Marshall, and those was an intense place to be during election cycles. And well, to say I miss it would be the wrong way to frame it, but eager to hear how you're experiencing it.
The way I'm experiencing it is this. So, disclaimer, I am working with Catholics for Kamala Harris. Okay. So there's a lot going on the ground for Democrats and Republicans religiously. Let me start with Lancaster first because that's sort of a hotbed of New Apostolic Reformation stuff. And lots of us have been looking at this and sort of wondering how they got their foothold, but they did get a foothold. So I would say Lancaster right now is probably going to go for Trump. That would be my guess. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is there's a lot of religiously sort of tangential things happening. I talked about Sean Foyt, I talked about Rod of Iron. There's all these other different groups. You notice that when Vance met with, and I just can't believe Lance Wall now, he was here outside of Scranton. Okay, so a lot of the pressure is being put in the middle of the state for Republicans and basically, trying to get their religious backers out. But there's a lot of people who would fall into what I would say, what Joe didn't quite say. And I'm going to I had a name for them back in 2008. I called them NASCAR Christians. These are the people who were like, I'm never going to church. I go, I stand up for the national anthem and everything else. And I have a God and country kind of thing. Those are my Christian nationalists, but we just didn't call them that back then. I think we have a lot of those in Pennsylvania. But the question is how tired are people are of Trump, right? So that's going to be a big thing. The second thing I think, which is really interesting, and I'll talk about this from the Democratic side, is that the tension I see in particularly in Philadelphia is going to be we have a very large Muslim community. The question is going to be whether or not they will come out for Kamala Harris with everything that is going on in with Israel and Palestine, okay, with Gaza. This is a very serious thing. College campuses are awash with it. I don't know what to think right now. Okay, all the emphasis has been on Michigan, but I think people need to think about especially this city because we have such a large Muslim community. Okay, and I think that's going to be that's a big question for me. In terms of Catholics, the Catholic outreach has been really interesting because they've been putting a lot of people in the middle of the state, but not on the sides. And so I'm wondering how this is going to pan out here within the next week and a half. I imagine that our city is going to be inundated because next week we get Bruce Springsteen here. So, that's religion of a different sort, right? That's probably a lot of Joe's people, right? Who are either nuns or maybe atheists, and they're going to come out and be happy to vote. And I think of these things as being religious because that's the uptick of this in the end, right? But I also think that we worry about Pennsylvania for two reasons. The question is going to be how much is it that um, religious beliefs, and I will say extreme religious beliefs, will have a measure in this election cycle. That's number one. And number two is how much will alienation with Trump be a factor in people voting for Kamala Harris? And will they be able to get over their racial proscriptions, right? People have referred to the middle of the state as Pennsylvania. I mean, it's nice. The demographics have changed in places like Allentown and others. I think Joe is right about demographics. I don't know that the Democrats are going to, benefit from this. But I will mention this because I want to say this because it happened today and it just infuriated me. This whole thing about what he said about Vanessa Gillian and not wanting to pay $60,000 to bury a Mexican. And this is the young woman who was raped and killed in Texas at one of the bases. And she was from Houston, and Trump bought her parents over and said that he would pay for her funeral, and then he backed out of it in the end. The rise of these stories coming out, there's been a continuation of all of these stories. And so the time horizon that Julie talked about, I think is really important because there's a different kind of time horizon going on with people. And there's one time horizon about the long game about what they're willing to play, but the other kind of time horizon is the instantaneous thing of people forgetting all the things that happened under Trump. What we have here is this kind of weird thing where people have distorted history. They don't remember 2020. You ask them, if they were better off now than they were back in 2020. And they're like, no, I was better off then. And I'm like, but we were all in lockdown and people were in your refrigerated trucks dying. And so there's this sort of religious thing about how people think about, history and how they want to do it. But there's this play of history. And I'm trying to figure this out, and I'm going to shut up in a minute. I'm trying to figure this out because there's tension about about history. There's the we won't go back, right? And then there's this we got to take our country back and we want to go back, right? Which denotes a certain kind of backwardness, but it's not just backwardness, it's about reinstantiating, a kind of racial and superiority hierarchy that is historically for them the history that they want to hear. So when you get a place like Oklahoma that's teaching kids all this bad stuff and want to use the 5995 Bible that Trump is selling, that's the tension I think that underlies this. It's not just religion, it's also history. I'll shut up.
Professor Ingersoll.
So I guess I'm up. Dispatches from Florida. Let's see. It's hard to say. There are way fewer Trump flags in my neighborhood. There's that. Don't know what to make of that. It's 4 years later, so who knows? It might be the factor of fatigue. We keep hearing about how everybody's just tired of the mess. They're not all anxious to put out flags and all that stuff. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, when I walk my dog, I see more Harris flags than I do Trump flags. Certainly wasn't true 4 years ago. Now, that does not mean that I think that Harris is going to win Florida or even my part of Duval County, which did go for Obama. So I think Trump will take Florida, but the tenor is different, and that's interesting. It does look as though the pro-abortion rights amendment is polling very strong. It has to get 60% of the vote in order to pass because it's a constitutional amendment. So it needs a super majority. Right now it's polling at 60%. So, that's all just going to come down to who turns out. But that could pass, which is an interesting thing. I mean, I was involved in a conversation with somebody on Twitter just the other day. How can people in Florida be voting for Trump and for this amendment? Well, that's the little sliver of people who are not Trump voters, but I mean that are Trump voters but are voting for the amendment are the same people that wanted it to be a states' rights issue, and they want their state to protect it. So, I think the exit polling on that question is going to be really interesting. In terms of what you both said, I was really interested in both presentations. Anthea, I had not heard this about the rod of iron, and that is fascinating to me. I'm always trying to figure out ways to mess up the boundaries and to show people how people that 10 years ago you thought wouldn't be able to even be in the same room with each other are now on the same team. And of course, the anti-cult network that was evangelicalism and fundamentalism 20, 30 years ago thought that the Moonies and their whole thing were cults. So it's fascinating to see that come together. And I followed the Rod of Iron Ministries a little bit for a while, but I didn't know that had happened. So thank you for that. And Joe, I have a question for you. So I love this idea of thinking about religious freedom as exception to state authority. And it does seem like, at least now, that those are the kinds of cases that come before the courts. I have done a little of this, more in the past than I do now. But I've always been pretty enamored with the work of Winnie Sullivan, and she seems to think that the kind of free exercise clause and the establishment clause really pull in opposite directions and can't possibly be, her book is The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. Basically, the argument for those listening, I know you guys know it, but for those listening, that basic argument is that if you're going to protect something the way that we've been protecting it, you have to define it. And if you define it, you have established it. So you can't have our no establishment clause and our free exercise clause the way that we have had them. And yet, well, Joe, it seems to sound like you think that we can have them, and I'm interested in you helping me make sense out of that. So if religious freedom is exception from state authority, how do we know what's religious? What counts? And legally speaking, obviously, I'm not asking for the,
Yeah, I mean, you're
the
right
end of my
that
stuff.
you're right that they're in tension, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And not to get too in the weeds, but quickly on it, secularism, or like the beliefs of non-believers, or what evangelicals in the 70s, like Francis Schaeffer and Tim LaHaye, would have called secular humanism, is not a religion for establishment, and it is a religion for free exercise. And there's a bunch of cases that show us this, and it's weird. So it's not for secular humanism because, Alabama judge W. Brevard Hand could not successfully get, textbooks teaching evolution out of schools, even though he wanted to, because he was arguing that they teach evolution. That's a tenet of this religion, secular humanism. The courts don't buy that secular humanism is a religion for any kind of establishment question. But for free exercise, atheists, since at least Torcaso v. Watkins in 1961, and other people like atheists, have been able to get protections as religious people, religious freedoms. And so for me, it's sort of like when I'm looking at the courts, I'm not looking for the pure logical truth. I think I'm looking at the empirical fact of this sort of interlocking, contradictory set of laws that are interpreted by judges who can't ever fully reconcile this system into an algorithm that can spit out a single output. And so that's really where all the strategy comes in. That's where all the confusion comes in. But it's just not the courts and law, maybe human life. It's just, it sort of resists that sort of symbolic logical purity.
Well, thank you. Now that we're on you, Professor Blankholm, if you had other reactions, thoughts to your colleagues, you have the floor. And otherwise, I invite our other panelists to jump back in with thoughts and questions. Certainly, the tangle of First Amendment issues here is rich. Absolutely. I'm wondering a fair bit about, so let's say in a worst case scenario, Trump does win. What's the story of religion on the left for the next 4 years? Where do people invest their energies? Where's the solidarity to be found? Where's something like hope to be found? And those are open questions. I don't know, obviously, but I'm wondering about that piece. Hopefully it's not the question we have to face.
A lot of people are going to be looking for the rapture.
Well, if those who don't believe in it may be looking for it. But
That's what I mean.
yeah, let me say a couple of things. One is I'm thinking about Bonhoeffer, believe it or not, because the Bonhoeffer family got on Eric Metaxas about saying things about him and how they have distorted his viewpoint. And I think that what is going to have to happen to, people who are of moderate to liberal persuasion in terms of their religious faith, they're going to have to start thinking about how do they dissent, right? How do they push back against what will be a hegemonic, like, rush, and that hegemonic rush will come very quickly. As we know, those of us who've read Project 2025, they've already vetted lots of people that they want to put into government. You'll have to do sort of an oath-taking thing, all of this kind of stuff. The thing that I've been thinking about a lot is this whole deportation thing, and that it's someplace like California, basically, that's going to be a big thing. Listen, we have deported people before, we have put people in camps before. It can happen again, okay? And so I'm very concerned about how will religious people respond to this. Are we going to have somebody like a Cardinal Dolan who was yucking it up with him last week be okay with this, right? As a Catholic bishop? Yeah, I have to ask that question, right? Because I'm wondering, what side will you be on? How will you choose, right? And this will be the choice that people will have to make. And this is going to be, terrible for, we haven't talked about sexuality very much here, but I'm very worried about, what happens to people who are transgender, who are, transitioning and won't be able to transition, parents who are having kids who want to transition that need to take them out of the state. We have the abortion thing is already horrible. My home state of Texas is completely horrific in terms of thinking about women's reproductive rights. We will have chaos in this country. And I think, I'm just going to take a moment here to just say something that may be apparent to people who travel and everything else. We're on the skids, folks. It's not good. And the ways in which we, this whole Make America Great Again thing and the narrative of declension and everything else, one of the things that Trump talked about a lot during his, first run was basically, I'm going to do infrastructure week, but the infrastructure is falling apart. We haven't even spoken about climate change and the people who are in Florida and Texas and on the Gulf Coast or in California who are having fires and floods and everything else. These things are not concerns of conservative Christians because they are like, this is God. It's going to all go away anyway. And this is what people of faith and who have no faith or are the nuns are going to have to contend with because we're going to have people in power who don't want to do anything about anything, let alone take a look your Social Security and provide, aid. The whole conspiracy theory thing has just been awful for people in North Carolina. But yet and still, Trump has been there for the past 2 days talking about stuff. And meanwhile, people haven't been able to get help from FEMA. So I'm going to shut up. But this basically, it's going to be bad.
Others?
Just a couple notes on some things that have come up in passing. I mean, let's think broadly, where are Christians going to stand when things get bad? I think that there's a story that's been told publicly, and that's been, I think, been repeated a lot among those of us who study religion, that mainline Christians are just fled, and religious decline is just going to continue until we look like the European numbers. But that's not really what we're seeing anymore. We're seeing the mainline denominations kind of stabilize. And so I think that maybe some of these major shifts they've happened and they maybe will pick up again. We might be looking at a situation in which people are turning to institutions like liberal Christian institutions as places where they can organize and mobilize. And politicians have known for a long time, if you want to mobilize people, you got to go to churches. That might not be the most popular thing to say if you're arguing for hardcore church and state separation or something, but that's where campaigns start and end. And so I think that, I don't know, we can't just say, all this blanket stuff about Christians. We can't just say religion's going to decline. And then, very briefly on the NASCAR Christians thing, it's such a good insight. Can we also say that we actually don't understand those people very well? Because there's all these people who now are identifying as evangelical Christian because it basically means Republican, and then they weren't 15 years ago. And so I don't think we actually really know how to talk about that. I'll say myself, I'm not sure how to talk about it yet, but I haven't found anyone else either. So that whole thing that you're describing, I want to look at that and try to think about that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we're down to our fading minutes here. We have just a couple minutes. Professor Ingersoll, you want to take us home, or Professor Butler? Well, something optimistic.
I'm deferring to the UCSB.
My answer was, I'm too dark. You don't want me to wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay.
You should do that, Greg. We haven't heard much from you. Why don't you put a bow on it for us?
I don't think there is such a thing on a night like this, but it's nice to know that we have fellow travelers. We're so grateful you joined us, that there's a lot of good thinking happening here, that I know a lot of students and community members and colleagues benefited from this conversation, that however things shake out on the night of the election, you all have helped us understand some of the stakes here and the histories and the maps forward. So that's just to say, let's be hopeful, and we'll be going down this path together. So thank you all for being with us tonight, and thanks to our great audience. I don't know if you all saw, but we had upwards of 200 people join us tonight, and that's just fabulous. So that's a real testament to you all, and alas, to the topic. So thank you, and good night, everybody. Dusty, thank you for holding us down and making everything work. Okay, you all take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.